Lay. I'm here at Smithsonian Archives in Washington, D.C. with Lisa Finakis. We'll be here for the next 15 minutes or so discussing female scientists whose field books are in the transcription center now, and we're interested in telling you a little bit more about them. So be sure to send us your questions if you have any, or comments. We look forward to hearing about that. So it may surprise you, but there were women scientists at the Smithsonian fairly early on in our history, although not many. The first woman professional at the Smithsonian came to work here in 1857. We were founded in 1846, and 11 years later, we hired Jane Turner as the librarian. And libraries have been one of the fields in which women could enter the professions. And she was here for 30 years, until 1887. In the late 19th century, a lot of women were able to enter the field of ethnology. They would focus on interacting with, learning from women in, for example, Native American cultures, since they were unlikely to talk to men about child rearing, childbirth, things like that, and domestic life. And another field where you saw a lot of women scientists was botany. For some reason, this became considered an appropriate field for women to work in. Women entered science a variety of other ways. Often it was that they had a relative. That's how Jane Turner became librarian. Her brother was librarian before her. Or they entered in fields appropriate for women, such as art or childhood education, something like that. So that takes us to one of our first women scientists at the Smithsonian to actually become a curator, and her name is Mary Jane Rathbun. And her brother had come to the Smithsonian as an invertebrate zoologist, worked on marine species, and she assisted him. But then he moved up in the Smithsonian hierarchy and then left the Smithsonian, so she took over the curatorship. And she was curator of invertebrate zoology, focusing on crabs. She was absolutely fascinated by them. She moved up the ranks over time, and she worked here from 1888 to 1940. Although many of those years she was unpaid, because in 1915 she gave up her paid position so she could hire a young male assistant and provide a curatorship to a young man. She was so dedicated that she was known to row a boat into work during a flood. So she was quite devoted to her crabs and to the Smithsonian itself. But again, this is a family connection that brought her into that kind of position. The next woman I'll give you a little information about entered very differently. Agnes Chase grew up in tremendous poverty. She was self-educated, but she went to work for the USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, as a scientific illustrator. She was moved into that position by several male mentors who really thought she was quite talented, and they asked if she could have access to the herbarium at night and on weekends so she could study. And in fact, she becomes a curator and world-renowned expert on grasses. She said they are what holds the earth together. And she came here around 1903 and worked here till 1963, till her death. And she was just quite a lively person. She was our suffragist. She actually went to jail over the suffrage movement, so we're quite proud of her for that. She loved to educate the public about grasses, and this, for example, is from her first book of grasses, which was a volume that helped people learn about grasses out there now, and it remains in print today, even though she produced it many, many decades ago. It's so popular. And she was an inveterate field worker. She traveled all over South America, collecting grasses in the field. And here she is on the top of the second highest mountain in Brazil, and with a mentee of hers, Dona Maria, and they would collect grasses together throughout Brazil. So she had quite a career at the Smithsonian and was really a leader among women scientists. She really liked to mentor younger women scientists. Now in the Transcription Center, we've also had things by this woman, Lucille Corman, who was a zoo editor. Her husband was director of the zoo. Here you see her hand rearing a tiger. And a number of her field notes and her oral history transcripts were transcribed in the Transcription Center earlier, and she's quite a fascinating figure. Another wonderful figure at the Smithsonian was Roxy Lay, who pursued an education on her own as the oldest of 14 children down south, came to work here as a specimen preparator. And she developed the entire field of what's called forensic ornithology, which was simply taking birds that had struck planes, often bringing those planes down and figuring out what bird it was so they could figure out how to get out of their flight paths. And she really was world-renowned for her work on bird identification. And she was just a great character at the Smithsonian. And then we had other women, like Sophie Letterlow, who was an elevator operator at the Smithsonian, but fascinated by insects, went to school at night and got the curators to hire her in entomology as a entomological technician. And she worked here for many, many years with the insect collections, which she loved. And when she retired, she said it was so hard to not come into work anymore and do what she so enjoyed. So she really had a successful career here. And then we had anthropologists such as Betty Magers. Her husband was also an anthropologist. She worked at the Smithsonian for over 70 years. She was never paid by us. She was always an unpaid research associate. She got grants and things like that, but her husband was the employee. She came here in an era where there were nepotism laws, so a wife couldn't be hired. But today I'm going to focus a little bit more. The first of two people we'll focus on, and that's someone named Devra Kleiman, who got a degree in 1970, a PhD, in mammalian psychology, or the study of mammalian animal behavior. And we see her here in a group shot with a bunch of her colleagues when she's quite a young scholar. 1970, she came to work at the Smithsonian's National Zoological Park, and that's where she spent her career working with animals there. And here we see a young Devra Kleiman at a meeting with one of her colleagues. You can see kind of the intensity of her focus. She was very distinguished scientist and really got a lot of very interesting programs going. The first one that really intrigued her was the golden lion tamarin. And this is a small primate from South America. And you can't see it in this black and white photo, and you'll see it in another one. They're a gorgeous golden orangey color, and they have these enormous manes and fascinating behavior. But they were almost extinct in the wild. There were a couple hundred left in the wild, and they were scattered around North American zoos, but the ones in North America had not lived outside of a zoo environment in the wild for many, many years. So she was fascinated by their group behavior. And here we see her working with some golden lion tamarins at the zoo. And you'll notice it's a fairly natural-looking setting that they're in. And what she decided to do was not only study the biology of the golden lion tamarin, but also focus on their behavior so that they could eventually be returned to the wild. She developed a very successful breeding program, looking at breeding behaviors and breeding biology and things. And then she started to train them how to live on their own at the National Zoo. So at first it was within an enclosed space, but very natural with lots of trees and everything, where they got some food but were expected to forage and kind of take care of themselves. And eventually they started living out in the wild in the National Zoo. They were in Rock Creek Park, just in the woods there. They never really went off the reservation because they're a very social group, but they learned to manage on their own. And then she began with another Brazilian biologist returning to them to the wild. And it's been a very, very successful program. There's almost 2,000 back in Brazil now. And it's really set the stage for a new approach. One of the things that she did was set up a large database of all the tamarins in the United States, where they had come from, basically doing genealogies, so she could develop a breeding strategy to maximize genetic diversity. And so she did this across the country, got all of these zoos that have been very proprietary before to agree to move animals around so they could breed for the maximum biodiversity, genetic diversity between them. And then she got them all to agree to deed them back to Brazil, to say that we only keep the animals here in trust. We are basically their guardians while they're here. But these are Brazilian animals, and we don't own them. We are simply their foster parents, their caregivers while they're here. And this was just absolutely a stunning change for zoos at that time period. So she really had a tremendous impact on the way that zoos run, and moving zoos into conservation biology with things like the breeding databases, what are now called species survival programs, but also the notion that they don't own these animals, that they are the foster parents trying to make sure that they live. So she was very successful. Here we see her working with one of the animals. This is in Brazil, and they're actually, all they're doing is measuring one of the ones to make sure that they're growing okay. And then she also worked on the giant panda. Now, when they came in 1972, she thought this was just kind of political and not terribly exciting, wasn't terribly interested in them. But as she said, they were a black box. We knew nothing about them. We really, really knew nothing about these animals. We knew nothing about their behavior. We knew nothing about how they lived, what they ate, how they bred. So she developed something that's very popular in many zoos now. She set up something called the Panda Watch, and she brought in volunteers doing citizen science, as you folks are, to watch the pandas, what they did 24/7, 365. And when they were done with this study, what they knew was a day in the life of the panda. And she also went to China, which is where you see her now, and learned about what they ate in the wild, how they behaved in the wild. And when she was done, they completely changed the habitat. They kept them together. They found they were not as solitary as they had thought they were. And they completely changed their diet, and we finally have a successful breeding program. But again, she worked with other zoos to really work. When we couldn't get our one panda to breed, we got some sperm from another one and things like that. But it made for a very, very successful program over time. So she had a tremendous impact on the National Zoological Park during her years. And because she's interested in behavior, what you're going to find is her notebooks are filled with details about animal behavior. And we're going to hear a little bit more about animal behavior now, because we're going to turn to Lisa, who's going to talk to us about someone who is fascinated by the social behavior of termites. And this is Margaret Collins. So Lisa?
Yes, Margaret Collins was another scientist here at the Smithsonian who really had a passion for animal behavior from her earliest years as a child, where she was exploring the woods of Institute, West Virginia, and really studying the world and the animals around her. Growing up in a town of Black intellectuals, her curiosity and passion really found fertile ground, and was a child prodigy, entering West Virginia State College at age 14. She had some great mentors at university, and during her PhD at the University of Chicago, she studied under a legendary termite expert, Alfred Emerson, who also protected her from some of the racism around her in Chicago in the 1940s. When she graduated in 1950, she became the first Black woman entomologist in this country. She followed her husband to Howard University and became an instructor there. And when she found her career stalling in Washington, she turned an obstacle into an opportunity by becoming a full professor at Florida A&M. In Florida, she married a second time and had 2 sons, but also felt the full weight of racism. When she was invited to speak at a nearby university, she found that invitation was withdrawn when she started receiving bomb threats. And in the face of this, she became a civil rights advocate and was active in a bus boycott in Tallahassee, Florida. And while that work did slow her research a little bit, it did not dim her passion. And she, later in her career, was able to combine her civil rights activism with some of her scientific research. In 1979, she chaired a symposium for the AAAS, and you can see the published program here, Science and the Question of Human Equality. In 1964, she came back to Washington, D.C. And Howard University, where she became a full professor. And at that time, she became affiliated with the Smithsonian. She was also a dedicated teacher and mentor and became a tenured professor at the Federal City College, what is now the University of District in Columbia. You can see some of her mentoring instincts here later in her career as she's in the lab working with one of her grandsons. 2 students from Howard University really sparked her interest in reopening a field station of her mentor Alfred Emerson in Guyana. And she did extensive field work throughout the 1970s across the globe, which culminated in 1979 with being able to reopen that field station. Some of the field books that you're seeing on the transcription project are from that time after she reopened that field station and from her work in Guyana. Later, during her field work, she contracted dengue fever, and that kept her out of the field for a while. But she again made this an opportunity to really focus on her research here at the Smithsonian. And even at 72, she returned to the field yet again and remained an active field biologist until the end of her life, dying on a research trip in 1996. And you can really see in some of her photos, this one here, for example, just the passion and joy she got from being out in the fields. So please do continue to share your questions in the comments with us, and we are here to answer questions for you.
All right. So our first question is, why is it so important that people out there transcribe all this work?
The field notebooks are a treasure trove of information that current scientists use all the time. Many of our field notebooks, for example, are used in conservation projects. So if someone like Margaret Collins has been out in the field and we learn what termites were in what area, what the density was, what they were eating, that sort of thing. If an area has been destroyed in some way and we want to go back and restore what was in there before, the field notebooks are going to have that information. But also current scientists who are studying some other aspect, let's say, of tamarin or termite behavior can go to their field notebooks and learn what was done in the field before. And when these are handwritten books, they're very hard to access that information. The scientist has to come here, sit down, figure out how to read that handwriting, which in the field isn't always, when you're balancing it on one knee to write, the easiest thing to read. If you have those field notebooks, you can readily search for and access that information. If you're studying the distribution of specific species and you do a search in that field notebook, you can find every location where that species or subspecies of termite was found on a particular island. So having that information at people's fingertips makes it really actively useful today for scientific reasons, for conservation reasons, and also just to get to know these wonderful women scientists who just thrilled at being out in the field.
Yeah. In addition, field books like this are really the primary document that records the contribution that these pioneering women made to the field. Yeah. It is really our primary source of the hard work they did and the things they contributed.
And one more. So what was each of your favorite things or favorite discovery that you found when researching these incredible women?
I hadn't realized just how innovative Devra Kleiman's work was, that she had really developed the whole Panda Watch program, that she had started developing the genealogy databases so you could figure out what to breed, and that she was the first to forge these agreements where that the animals belonged to the country they had come from. So these were really major step forwards in conservation. I always knew that she was a major figure there, but never quite understood how creative a thinker she was and what lasting impact this had had on the field of animal conservation.
And in researching Margaret Collins, I think one of the things that struck me was the way in which she mentored so many students in all of her different positions in a way that really fostered the next generation of entomologists. But I have to say, perhaps my favorite story about her is one from her childhood, where her family tells this story of her going out and analyzing the behavior of birds and insects and all sorts of flying animals, and coming back in and telling her parents that she didn't think Santa Claus's reindeer could really fly and that Santa was a real thing because she had studied the biology of reindeer and there was just no way they could possibly fly.
So an observational scientist from her earliest years.
All right. Well, thank you to everyone who's joined us today to honor the work and achievements of these groundbreakers. And please do continue to follow along as we celebrate the rest of Women's History Month on the Smithsonian Transcription Center. If you have any additional questions, please do comment here. We'll keep watching the comments and answer them as we can. And you can find this video soon on our YouTube channel as well. So thanks so much for tuning in and have a great week.